I knew my wife well enough that that would have been embarrassing for her. I did not want the EMTs to come in and see her naked.
Sometimes I wonder, how many secrets are hidden behind church doors, behind polite smiles and warm Sunday greetings? I used to believe that certain people, pastors, teachers, fathers, were somehow safer, better, more trustworthy. However, I then stumbled upon this story, a story that still chills me to my bones. A respected Texas pastor who held his congregation spellbound with his sermons. A devoted wife and mother, beloved by her students and friends. Two daughters who adored both their parents, never suspecting the darkness growing under their own roof. And one night, when everything changed forever, police found a woman lying lifeless in her bed. A typed suicide note was nearby. Sleeping pills were scattered like clues nobody bothered to see. At first, everyone believed the note. They believed her husband's tears. Because why wouldn't they? He was the pastor, the man of God. But piece by piece, the mask slipped. There was a mistress, a secret confession, a staged crime scene, executed with precision. And a revelation so shocking, even seasoned investigators nearly missed it. I'm telling you now, this isn't just the story of a murder. It's the story of how one man fooled almost everyone, and how a mother's family refused to let her voice be silenced. Today, I'm pulling back the curtain on the twisted double life of Matt Baker, the pastor who nearly got away with killing his wife. Because in the end, the truth was buried under layers of lies, until a few brave souls clawed it out into the light. And it makes me wonder, how well do we know the people we love? Are we sure our lives aren't built on secrets we've yet to discover? Before we dive in, I have to ask you, do you think it's possible to hide a double life, even from your closest family? Tell me in the comments. I want to know what you believe, because after hearing this story, you might never look at anyone the same way again. While you're here, let me know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. It always amazes me how these stories reach people from all over.
It was sometime mid-March. He said that, she took sleeping pills every night, so maybe he could make it look like she overdosed on sleeping pills.
April 7th, 2006. A Friday night in Hewitt, Texas. The kind of small town where people feel safe leaving their doors unlocked. The kind of town where the pastor's family is almost royalty. I keep thinking about how ordinary that day must have started for Kari Baker. She taught her elementary school classes, smiled at her students, and probably planned the weekend ahead with her daughters. And I wonder if she knew, if somewhere deep inside, she sensed that this day would be her last. Because according to Matt Baker, everything seemed normal that evening. He would later tell police that Kari had been quiet, withdrawn, and tired. That she'd gone to bed early. That he'd stayed up watching TV, alone. But here's where the timeline starts to slip like sand through fingers. Because what Matt claimed happened next is where the shadows creep in. He said he went into the bedroom and found Kari lying unresponsive in bed. He said he tried to wake her, shaking her gently, calling her name. He said he dialed 911 in a panic, telling the dispatcher his wife wasn't breathing. I've listened to parts of that 911 call. The voice on the line is controlled. Almost too controlled. No sobbing. No hysteria. Just a man calmly reporting that his wife might have taken her own life. When first responders arrived, they found Kari lying on her back in the bed. Sleeping pills were scattered on the nightstand. A typed suicide note waiting to be discovered. And in that moment, the entire room seemed to scream suicide. Matt told police his wife had been struggling with depression, especially since the tragic loss of their daughter Cassidy years earlier. He told them he'd been worried about her, that she'd been distant, sad. And at first, everyone believed him. Because who questions a grieving husband, especially one wearing a pastor's collar? The police didn't see signs of a struggle. There was no blood, no obvious trauma. So they did something that would haunt this case for years to come. They accepted Matt's story, and they didn't order an autopsy. No autopsy on a healthy, 31-year-old woman who supposedly took her own life. I still can't get over that decision. Because buried inside Kari's body were answers no one would discover until it was nearly too late. Meanwhile, as police wrapped up the scene, Matt Baker stood there, the grieving husband. People comforted him, offered prayers. No one seemed to notice that the typed suicide note wasn't signed. No one questioned how calm he seemed. No one thought it odd that he'd typed the note himself, to show police what Kari might have written. That's the explanation he gave, that he'd typed it himself after finding his wife dead. And if you think that sounds suspicious, you're not alone. But at the time, most people just nodded and said they'd keep the pastor and his family in their prayers. Meanwhile, Kari's family was left devastated and deeply uneasy, because the Kari they knew wasn't suicidal. She'd been making plans, dreaming about summer vacations, talking about her kids' future. Kari's mother, Linda, kept replaying that night in her mind. And the more she thought about it, the more certain she became that Matt's story didn't add up. But at first, it seemed like nobody would listen. Matt Baker almost got away with murder that night. Almost. Because tiny cracks were beginning to show, and the truth was waiting, patient and silent, just beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to dig it out. And that brings me to a question I can't stop thinking about. If someone you loved died unexpectedly, even if it looked like suicide, would you demand an autopsy? Or would you trust what you were being told? Tell me in the comments. I want to know what you'd do, because sometimes the difference between justice and getting away with murder is just one question nobody thought to ask. I've always believed that grief has no script. Some people collapse under its weight. Some people turn silent and numb. And some people perform grief so perfectly that it becomes another mask they wear. In the weeks after Kari Baker's funeral, Matt Baker's mask was slipping in ways almost nobody noticed at first. At the memorial, he was the picture of a heartbroken husband. Tears were streaming down his face. His voice was trembling as he spoke about losing the love of his life. People hugged him, murmuring how strong he was. But behind the scenes, things were different. Kari's family tried to stay close to him and the girls. They wanted to help, to grieve together. But Matt began pulling away. He stopped returning calls. He seemed irritated by their questions. It was as though, now that Kari was gone, he wanted to erase the people who loved her most. And then there was his behavior in public. I keep coming back to one detail I read in the court records. Just weeks after Kari's funeral, Matt Baker was spotted laughing at a party, joking with friends. Not a man hollowed out by grief, but a man free of a burden he'd long been carrying. At first, people told themselves he was trying to cope, that he deserved to move forward. But the speed with which he seemed to move forward was stunning, because soon, rumors started swirling through their small Texas community. Matt Baker wasn't just socializing. He was dating again, and not just any woman. He was in a relationship with the daughter of the church's music minister, a woman he'd been seeing before Kari died. Suddenly, the story Matt had been telling began to unravel. This wasn't a man grieving his soulmate. This was a man who had already started building a new life, while his wife was still alive. And the woman he'd been seeing would become the key to exposing Matt's lies. Because she told a story so shocking, it changed everything. She said that Matt Baker confessed to her that he'd staged Kari's suicide. He told her that Kari had become a problem, that she was in his way. He wanted to be free to marry someone else. He described how he'd crushed sleeping pills into a drink, how he'd typed the suicide note himself to cover his tracks. I can barely wrap my mind around it even now. A pastor, standing in his pulpit, preaching about God and morality, while plotting how to kill his wife so he could keep his mistress. It's one of the most disturbing juxtapositions I've ever encountered. And the mistress, tormented by what she knew, finally stepped forward. Her testimony, filled with raw emotion and guilt, became a turning point in the investigation. Because for the first time, someone from Matt's inner circle confirmed the unthinkable. That Kari Baker hadn't chosen to die. Her husband had chosen it for her. I keep thinking about Kari, living under the same roof with the man planning her murder. How many mornings did she pour him coffee, never suspecting he was plotting to end her life? How many church services did she attend, listening to him preach about love and forgiveness, while he was counting down the days until she was gone? It's a question that makes me sick to my stomach every time I think about it. Because the truth is, monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the man standing at the front of the church, holding a Bible. And that brings me to something I keep wrestling with. Do you believe grief has a normal timeline? Or does moving on quickly always mean there's something suspicious underneath? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts, because in stories like this one, the line between grief and guilt can be terrifyingly thin. If there's one thing I've learned from stories like this, it's that the people who refuse to stop asking questions are often the ones who save the truth from being buried forever. And in Kari Baker's case, That person was her mother, Linda. From the very beginning, Linda couldn't accept what everyone else seemed so ready to believe. She couldn't believe that her daughter, a woman full of life, plans, and love for her children, would simply give up and choose to die. She replayed the conversations she'd had with Kari in the weeks before her death. Kari talking about summer vacations, about her girls' school events, about the future. Nothing, absolutely nothing, sounded like a woman ready to leave her life behind. And the more Linda thought about it, the more certain she became that Matt Baker was lying. At first, people told her she was imagining things, that she was too emotional, that she needed to let go. But Linda refused. Because in her heart, she knew her daughter. She knew Kari wouldn't have killed herself. So she did something that would change everything. She hired a lawyer and private investigators. She started collecting every piece of information she could get her hands on. At first, the authorities didn't want to reopen the case. They believed Matt. They believed the suicide note. They believed the story that Kari was depressed and couldn't go on. But Linda kept pushing. And then, the evidence began to trickle in. Financial records showed Matt had been moving money around. Computer activity revealing searches for topics related to suicide and how to stage it. Timeline inconsistencies about where Matt had been and how long he'd been in the bedroom before calling 911. And that suicide note, the one Matt claimed Kari had written, it was typed and signed. And the investigators began asking the same question Linda had been screaming from the beginning. Why would a woman planning to kill herself type out a note and then not sign her name? It's a detail so small, yet so chilling once you realize how calculated it is. Piece by piece, the wall Matt Baker had built around himself started to crack. And then a new player entered the story. A Texas Ranger named Matt Cawthon. If Linda was the emotional engine behind this case, Ranger Cawthon was the bulldozer that broke it wide open. He'd seen plenty of crime scenes in his career, but something about this one gnawed at him. He started re-interviewing witnesses, piecing together timelines, studying phone records and emails. And every time he dug deeper, the same truth kept surfacing. Kari Baker didn't kill herself. Someone made it look like she did. And that someone was Matt Baker. I keep imagining Linda, sitting across the table from investigators, her voice shaking with grief and fury, refusing to back down. And I wonder how many other families would have given up. How many other cases have slipped through the cracks because nobody had the strength or the resources to keep fighting for the truth. Linda's persistence transformed this case from a tragic, closed file into a murder investigation. She went from feeling helpless and hopeless to being the force that tore Matt Baker's carefully constructed lies apart. Because in the end, Kari Baker's voice was silenced, but her mother refused to let her story die with her. And that might be the most powerful kind of love there is. And then, there was something else. Something small enough to be overlooked, but powerful enough to shatter Matt's story into pieces. As Kari's family sifted through her things, they found her Bible. Tucked inside was a note Kari herself had written. A message that, in just a few words, revealed the truth she'd been too afraid to say out loud. She wrote that if anything ever happened to her, people should look at Matt. That tiny message spoke louder than any suicide note ever could. Kari Baker may have been silenced, but even from the grave, she managed to point the finger at the man who took her life. And that single note in her Bible became a weapon Kari's family, and the prosecution, would never let go. And now, I want to ask you something that's been on my mind since I first read about this case. If you suspected foul play in a loved one's death, would you have the strength to keep pushing for the truth, even if everyone around you said you were wrong? Tell me in the comments. Because sometimes, one person's refusal to give up is the only thing standing between justice and a killer getting away forever. There's a moment in every true crime story when the tide finally turns. When whispers become evidence. When secrets claw their way into the light. And for Kari Baker's family, that moment came from the most unexpected place of all. The woman who'd been part of the betrayal. Matt Baker's mistress. For months, she'd been living with the burden of what she knew. She tried to convince herself that Matt was telling the truth. That maybe Kari really had been depressed. But late at night, when the world was quiet, Matt's words echoed in her ears. Because he hadn't just told her Kari was suicidal. He'd confessed. He'd described how he crushed sleeping pills into Kari's drink. How he'd typed the suicide note himself. how he'd staged the scene so that everyone would believe the perfect pastor's wife had chosen to end her own life. I can't imagine the weight of carrying a secret like that. Knowing the man you love is a murderer. Knowing that an entire community sees him as a spiritual leader, a man of God, while you alone know he's capable of killing his wife. In the end, it was guilt, and maybe fear, that pushed Matt's mistress to do the right thing. She went before a grand jury and told them everything. Every detail Matt had confessed to her. And that testimony cracked the case wide open. Investigators started re-interviewing witnesses. Church members remembered odd things Matt had said after Kari's death. Friends recalled how quickly he'd moved on, how eager he seemed to push Kari's memory aside. The evidence, once dismissed as coincidence or grief, began to look like a carefully constructed lie. And then, in March of 2009, the news broke like a thunderclap across Texas. Matt Baker, beloved pastor, father, community leader, was indicted for murder. Reporters described the shock rippling through Waco and the surrounding towns. People who'd once prayed with Matt, who'd trusted him with their secrets and their families, now stared at his mugshot on the evening news. The betrayal was staggering. Because this wasn't some stranger. This was their pastor. Matt Baker's defense team moved quickly, trying to block evidence. They argued there was no physical proof tying Matt directly to Kari's death. No fingerprints on the pills. No DNA linking him to the supposed overdose. They claimed everything was circumstantial. A grieving husband was unfairly targeted because he'd chosen to move on with his life. And for a moment, I wondered if the jury would believe him. Because Matt was good at pretending. He'd fooled nearly everyone for years. Why not one more time? But then I think about Kari's mother, sitting in that courtroom, refusing to look away, because she knew the truth. And she wasn't going to let Matt Baker talk his way out of this one. And it makes me wonder, would you believe the word of a mistress in a murder trial? Or would you be skeptical, thinking maybe she had motives of her own? Tell me in the comments. Because sometimes, the person we least expect becomes the only voice telling the truth. By the time Matt Baker stood trial in 2010, the mask he'd worn for so many years was finally beginning to crumble. Yet even as the courtroom filled with reporters, Kari's family, church members, and curious strangers, there was a lingering question in the air. Would a jury be willing to convict a pastor, a man of God, with no physical evidence tying him directly to the murder? I remember reading accounts of that trial and feeling my own pulse quicken, because this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a battle for Kari Baker's truth. The prosecution laid out their case piece by piece, like assembling a puzzle whose final image was horrifying. They described a staged crime scene, a woman placed in her bed as if she'd simply fallen asleep, a bottle of sleeping pills left conspicuously close, a typed suicide note waiting to explain it all away. They showed how the suicide note didn't bear Kari's handwriting or her signature, and how Matt himself admitted he'd typed it after finding her dead, claiming he was helping police understand her state of mind. They revealed the motive hiding in plain sight. Matt's affair, his fantasies of a new life free from his marriage, his kids, and his responsibilities. And then there was the mistress's testimony, how Matt had confessed the entire plan to her in detail. But the defense fought back hard. They told the jury there was no direct physical evidence, no fingerprints on crushed pills, no DNA linking Matt to the poison. They painted Kari as a woman haunted by depression and past tragedy, especially the death of her daughter Cassidy. They argued that her suicide, while devastating, was not murder. And for a moment, it seemed possible the jury might believe them. Because how do you prove murder when the victim's body was never autopsied? How do you convict a man whose very profession is built on trust and faith? But testimony after testimony began chipping away at Matt's carefully crafted story. Witnesses recalled how fast he'd moved on. Friends spoke about offhand comments Matt had made, hinting at wanting out of his marriage. And then there was the mistress, her voice trembling on the stand, recounting how Matt whispered secrets about crushing sleeping pills and staging a suicide. I can only imagine the tension in that courtroom as the jury retired to deliberate. Kari's family, holding their breath. Matt Baker, still projecting the same calm he'd used to fool so many for so long. But when the jury finally returned, the words were devastating, and yet, a relief. Matt was found guilty. In January of 2010, Matt Baker was convicted of murdering his wife, Kari. The judge sentenced him to 65 years in prison. Even as the gavel fell, I've read that the courtroom was silent for several long seconds. Because it was the end of a nightmare, but also the confirmation that a trusted pastor had committed an unthinkable act. Kari's family delivered emotional statements in court. Linda Baker, Kari's mother, spoke with a trembling voice about how her daughter would never get to watch her girls grow up, how a piece of their family had been ripped away forever. The community was left reeling. People who'd once turned to Matt Baker for guidance and comfort were forced to reckon with the fact that a man who'd preached about faith and morality was capable of murder. And I keep thinking about Kari in all of this. Her life was reduced to court transcripts and testimony. Her memory was the only thing her family had left to fight for. And I wonder how many more truths are hidden behind polite smiles and soft-spoken words. Because if a pastor could murder his wife, who else might be hiding secrets we can't even begin to imagine? Even after the trial ended and Matt Baker was led away in handcuffs, the echoes of this story didn't fade. Because evil doesn't vanish just because a verdict is read. It lingers in the silence left behind, in the lives forever changed. After his conviction, Matt Baker sat behind prison walls and gave interviews. In those conversations, he continued to insist on his innocence. He denied killing Kari. He claimed the police twisted evidence and that his affair was just a terrible mistake, but not proof of murder. Even as he wore a prison uniform, Matt kept trying to rewrite the story, to cast himself as the misunderstood victim. And for a moment, I wondered how many people might still believe him. Because that's the power some manipulators have. Even when the facts stand stacked against them, they spin new stories, hoping someone, anyone, will listen. Over the years, there have been legal motions, attempts to appeal. But the truth has held firm. Matt Baker remains in prison, serving his 65-year sentence for Kari's murder. Meanwhile, Kari's family is carried on. They've spoken publicly about her life. About the mother who adored her daughters, the teacher who poured love into her classroom, the woman whose laughter once filled their home. They keep Kari's memory alive, not as a victim, but as a vibrant person who deserved so much more than the fate Matt chose for her. And this story leaves me wrestling with bigger questions. Because the hardest part about this case isn't just that Matt Baker killed his wife. It's that for years, almost everyone believed him. He hid behind the image of a respectable pastor, a man of faith. And in doing so, he showed us something terrifying. That domestic violence can hide in the most unexpected places. Behind the doors of beautiful homes. Behind the pulpit of a church. Behind the eyes of someone who seems gentle and kind. Too often, we look away from warning signs because we can't imagine that someone respectable, someone we admire, could be capable of such darkness. But monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes, they look like the man who blesses your marriage, who baptizes your children, who shakes your hand every Sunday. And that's why Kari Baker's story matters. Because it reminds us that the truth can be hidden beneath even the most perfect facade, but it also shows that courage and persistence can bring that truth roaring into the light. So I have one last question for you. Do you think Matt Baker's role as a pastor made it easier for him to hide what he'd done? Why do you think we sometimes ignore red flags when someone seems respectable? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. Because the only way we stop people like Matt Baker is by refusing to stay silent. As I close the pages of this story, I keep thinking about Kari Baker, about the mother who loved fiercely, about the teacher who lit up her classroom with patience and kindness, about the woman whose life was stolen, not just by her husband's hands, but by the layers of lies he spun around her memory. And I think about Kari's family, their pain, their relentless fight for justice, their refusal to let her story be buried beneath a false narrative of suicide. This case is more than just a tale of murder. It's a reminder of how fragile the bonds of trust can be, and how sometimes, even the people we think we know best may be harboring secrets dark enough to destroy lives. A mother's love, a family's determination, and the tragic reminder that even the people we trust most may be harboring deadly secrets. If this story moved you, even just a little, I hope you'll help keep Kari Baker's memory alive. Share this video. Tell someone about her story. Because the more we speak these names aloud, the less chance there is for monsters to hide in the shadows. And tell me below, how well do you think you know the people closest to you? I'm listening. And I know, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones closest to home. If you found this video compelling, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. There are more stories to tell. And together, we'll keep shining light into the darkest corners. See you in my next video.